3 people logged in. There's probably around 58 people watching because there's quite a lot of doubled up, which is pretty good.
Good.
And there's a dog as well.
Has he paid his membership fee?
I didn't ask that. You have to ask the Coles.
Yeah.
Has your dog paid the membership? Now he's waving at us. Very good.
Right, we'll just wait for the Stephen's screen.
Yes, which I can't see at them. Oh, here we go. I'll start the recording and turn my thing on.
Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to our January talk on Prinny and the Excesses of Regency Style, or a voluptuary under the horrors of digestion, which is a fascinating title. I hope that you have also had a chance to look at the interesting words in the newsletter about guiding at Titsy. The guides do need a little bit of help when the time comes to reopen, and there is information on the newsletter about how to get involved in that, and it sounds very interesting. Today we will get to know the Regency period a lot better. Firstly, perhaps by defining when was it. With its exuberant excesses, the Prince Regent became the major celebrant of this, and as part of his well-known character. The work of Gilray depicts him most unflatteringly, as I'm sure you've seen in the cartoon on the newsletter. Was it entirely true or not? Or was it even an underestimate? Our speaker today, Stephen Richardson, is an art historian who specialises in this period. He's also a guide at the Royal Academy and at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So please welcome Stephen Richardson. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you've noticed the word voluptuary used in the alternative title to this lecture. Now, the dictionary definition of voluptuary is a person given up to luxury and sensual pleasure. In this talk, it's used as a metaphor for the excesses of Regency taste, although come the end, you may realise that there is something of a twist. The Regency was an era of great contrasts, of wealth and poverty, of extremes of taste, both good and bad, as we shall see. And it was also a time of radical political developments, a time blessed with technical innovation and cursed by the Napoleonic Wars. This lecture is intended to explore the issue of Regency style and to unravel a complex and perhaps misunderstood period in British history. My talk will move from the important influence of Prinny, the Prince Regent, onto the extraordinary developments of British architectural and decorative fashion during the Regency period. It is a very visual experience. There are many images. I hope that you will enjoy them. But who was Prinny? Here we see George, Prince of Wales, as a young man, a portrait by John Hopner. As you will see, this portrait can be found in the care of the Wallace collection. Once we can do so, please show your much needed support for the museums, galleries, and historic houses that I'm going to refer to. His full name was George Augustus Frederick of Hanover, born in 1762, and he died in 1830. He became Prince of Wales in his infancy, thus known as Prinny to his friends. He was Prince Regent from 1811 on the occasion of his father's ill health, and ultimately King George IV from 1820. The Regency period is generally regarded as starting around his 21st birthday in 1783 and ending with the death of his younger brother William IV in 1837. then to be followed, of course, by the reign of Queen Victoria. But who do we think of as George, Prince of Wales? Is it this character? The wonderful Hugh Laurie from Blackadder? Was he vain? Probably. Extravagant? Probably. Profligate? Almost certainly. He was certainly a leader of fashion. But to call him thick, is that really fair? He was largely disliked by the general public, but I think he's been unfairly treated by history. He, of course, would rather have been thought of like this. This is George, Prince of Wales. This time, the artist is Sir Thomas Lawrence, and who was pretty much the prince's favourite artist. Politically, he was aligned to the Whig Party, the modern day equivalent of the Liberals. And that was generally assumed to be because it was an irritation to his father, who was a devout Tory. As John mentioned, he's been cruelly targeted by caricaturists over the years, and Gilray was particularly poisonous. And here we see a voluptuary under the horrors of digestion, from which the title of this talk is derived. So we see Prinny here as Prince of Wales, a large distended glutton, leaning back on an armchair at a table covered with the remains of a meal, holding a fork to his mouth as a toothpick. His waistcoat is held together by a single button across his stomach. Empty bottles lurk under the table, and gaming lice lie on the floor. In the background, instead of a coat of arms, we see the Prince of Wales' 3 ostrich feathers emblem, shown above a knife and fork crossed on a plate. The picture above the prince is of Luigi Cornaro, a Venetian nobleman who wrote several treatises concerning dieting and eating habits. There is in fact a pendant print to accompany this, which shows his rather frugal father, George III, sitting at a miserable breakfast table, eating a boiled egg with a spoon. But here is Prinny in his coronation robes. It looks vaguely ridiculous today, of course. But let's take a look at everyday fashion. We perhaps see the emergence of modern dress. For the ladies, bonnets are very fashionable and using flowers and fruit as hat decorations. Gone are the panniers of earlier dress. Instead, we see the French Empire line with the waist drawn up to the bust. For the men, wigs are no longer fashionable, and the breeches are evolving into trousers. It's Jane Austen. Think of Mr. Darcy and Miss Bennet. Notice also the high-necked cravat, which was popularized by the prince's friend, Beau Brummel. Now, this style actually evolved into the formal dress we're familiar with today, the white tie and tails. English dress becomes recognizable worldwide, even in China. Now, you might contrast this with the American equivalent today, which is, of course, jeans and a t-shirt. Regency-inspired costume is, of course, very much a feature of the current television series Bridgerton, which is, shall we say, a rather liberal interpretation of Regency England. Architecturally, other recognizable symbols of the Regency include the Nash Terraces, seen across central London. Here we see painted stucco or render used to create facades in imitation of stone. Bay windows, balconies, delicate iron railings, conservatories, awnings, all of these became fashionable during the Regency times. And the architect John Nash worked extensively for the Prince of Wales. Nash's work was all about appearance rather than solid, enduring construction, perhaps adding to the somewhat frivolous reputation of the Regency. And here's another example of Nash's work. Here we see Regent Street. Now note the presence of soldiers in this image. At this time, there was the potential for much public unrest. Revolutionary influences were sweeping across Europe. And in fact, Regent Street formed a grand processional route, enabling troops to move swiftly from the Regent's Park Barracks to Carlton House, the Prince's London home. And I have an image here of Carlton House. Now this was, this was located off Pall Mall at the junction of Waterloo Place and the Duke of York Steps. Today it's known as Carlton House Terrace. The house was given to the Prince on his 21st birthday. And here we see it in its later form following the reworking of a much earlier house. And it became a major project of the Prince before its eventual demolition in 1825. During his ownership, it was constantly refashioned and redecorated at great expense. All that remains today are those columns that we see here at the entrance, which welcome you as you enter the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. And here I'm going to show you a floor plan of Carlton House. Now, at the top, you can see a basement. That basement level, the property was built on an elevated embankment. So therefore, the basement appears to be the ground floor if looking at the building from the Mall. It falls away at that point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a little tour of the inside of the building. So here are the columns that we've just been looking at. Hopefully you'll be able to see this cursor that I'm moving on the screen now. We're going to go into the building. We're going to take a look at the entrance hall. Then we'll make our way back to take a peek into the Crimson Drawing Room. Back again through the house, past the staircase. We're going to look into the Blue Velvet Room. We'll come back, we'll look into the Rose Satin Room with its bay window looking out over the Mall. Then we'll come back and we'll make our way down the stairs to the staircase, to the basement level. And we will go along to the Corinthian Room, where we will hopefully meet George. And then we'll take a look in the Gothic dining room, and then we'll scurry through the basement level and to look at the conservatory. Now, if there is an image of one of the attendees at the meeting in this corner, you can, of course, minimize it or move it out of the way to see where I'm at this present moment in time. So let's see how we go. So first of all, we're going to go into the Great Hall, which is a typical Georgian entrance hall, classically inspired, very much regarded as the correct taste for a building of this nature. It was designed by the architect Henry Holland in the earlier phases of the redevelopment of the house, a sort of restrained 18th century classicism, I suppose you would call it. Notice the Ionic columns and the coffered ceiling here, very typical. And this hall actually survived much of the later modeling of the building. But now I'll take you through into the real Regency experience. We'll go into the Crimson Drawing Room. Now, what do we notice here? Well, it's very sumptuous. The upholstery, you can see there, crimson velvet everywhere, those amazing drapes, heavily velveted, the passementerie or the fringes there, gilded, heavily decorated, very comfortable. The large chandeliers. And notice also the wall-to-wall carpet in this room. which was pretty much a Regency invention. Gone were the old rugs. Instead, we create a much more comfortable experience. In a sense, we've created a kind of a lavish Roman-inspired interior. Let's go on to the blue velvet room, which continues very much in a similar fashion. Now, originally, this room had painted walls, which were replaced with these panels with hung fabrics. Again, wall-to-wall carpets, sumptuous furnishings, large chandeliers, very extravagant drapes. The upholstered, sorry, I beg your pardon, the lined panels were used to display a growing collection of the prince's paintings. Now, like many people of this period, he very much admired French style, even Napoleonic style. He loved French painting and Dutch masters, essentially turning away from the Italian old masters, which were becoming less fashionable. At the rear wall there, we can see a particularly important work from the Royal Collection. This is Rembrandt's Shipbuilder and His Wife. Now we'll move through to the rose satin room. Again, wall-to-wall carpet, heavy use of drapes, crystal chandelier. There's the bow window looking out down onto the Mall. And we can see here some of the Prince's collection of Dutch old masters. The great diarist and gossip, and arbiter of taste, Horace Walpole, commented, "There is an august simplicity that astonished me. You cannot call it magnificent. It is the taste and propriety that strike. Every ornament is at a proper distance and not one too large, but all delicate and new, with more freedom and variety than Greek ornaments." By Greek ornaments, he's referring to classical style that was popular in the 18th century. But the key word here is variety. This is a word we must retain for reference. Now we're going to go down to the basement level. We're going to follow this servant down the staircase, and we'll make our way round to the Corinthian room. So called because of the decoration here. We can see these Corinthian style columns. It looks a little odd, but what we have here is an alcove with a very comfortable sofa set in it. At the back of the alcove is a mirror which faces another mirror, creating this kind of infinity effect. In the foreground, an English-made circular table with a tripod base, very popular during the Regency times. And here, as you can see, a Chinese vase, Chinese style, very popular with the Prince. And it will make another appearance later in the lecture. And here we meet George, sitting in the same alcove, slightly different sofa being used here, but we can see the circular table, which has been pushed to one side. Instead of a mirror, that's been substituted with a painting. The artist, again, was Sir Thomas Lawrence. This was 1822, so he was the king by this time. He was also 60 years of age and considerably rotund. So you might imagine a certain amount of artistic license has been employed in bringing this about. Adjacent to the Corinthian room is the Gothic dining room, designed by our friend John Nash. Gothic, or the medieval revival style, first became popular in the middle of the 18th century as a counter for the craze for continental classicism. There was a resurgence of interest in it during the early part of the 19th century, and in fact it went on to become really the dominant theme during the Victorian period. And if we stretch our way across the basement level to the far end, we come to the Gothic conservatory. Now, the inspiration behind this building was the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey. Like many Regency buildings, it is a brilliant conceit, made of cast iron with plaster decoration. And like everybody else's conservatory, it leaked, and it leaked badly. Now, the Prince also made extensive use of temporary buildings and extensions for entertaining, such as a reception he held here for the Duke of Wellington in 1814, when apparently there were 3,000 guests and a long line of trestle tables was laid out from one end of the basement to the other. And the Prince and the Duke sat as guests of honor, I guess, on a dais at the far end of the conservatory here. The house was demolished in 1825. The main furniture and fittings were moved to Windsor Castle and the newly conceived Buckingham Palace. And some of the Chinese contents were moved to Brighton, and we'll come back to that in a while. But what of the Gothic inspiration? Look at those columns and the fan vaulting stretching up to heaven. Could we also imagine the imitation of living trees, such as this tree cathedral? We now leave behind the extravagances of Carlton House and move through this avenue and out into the natural world to seek the spirit of the Regency and to explore some important philosophical influences on early 19th century style. And these included Romanticism. This is The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. But what is Romanticism? It's a complex subject and worthy of a lecture in its own right. In short, it's a wonder at the power of nature and a turning away from science and the Enlightenment. You could say it's a reaction against the horrors of the Industrial Revolution. Artists and writers begin to focus on strong emotional reactions, such as terror, horror, and especially awe. For example, awe at untamed nature, as we see here. It was the time of the Romantic poets, Shelley, Wordsworth, Edgar Allan Poe. Gothic or horror novels become popular. Jane Austen even got in on the act. Northanger Abbey is in reality a Gothic satire. Romanticism isn't necessarily about romance, but raw Roman emotions. And leaving the drama behind, the Regency also was informed by the late 18th century picturesque movement, the idea that a view or a subject was suitable for a painting. These are the ruins of Tintern Abbey on the Welsh-English border. Now, interest in Gothic or medieval style was actually aided by the Napoleonic Wars, as it was no longer safe to travel across Europe. This is another day, a present day image, the Chancellor Crossing. So we're inside the ruins of Tintern here. And instead, artists realized that an exploration of rural Britain could compete with the classically orientated tours of the continent. Irregular anti-classical ruins become sought after sites, inspiring painters such as Constable and Turner. Now, this image we see of today shows the interior denuded of vegetation. But back in the 1790s, Turner visited and saw it like this. So how do these movements inform Regency style? Architects emphasize the connection between a building and its environment. This is Cronk Hill on the Attingham estate in Shropshire. Designed by John Nash in around about 1802. It's regarded as the first Italianate picturesque villa. The intention was to set the building within the landscape. We also see the emergence of eccentric buildings, such as this one. This is à la Ronde, near Exmouth in Devon. Again, set within the landscape. It's a 16-sided house intended to take advantage of the views surrounding it. It was created for two cousins, Jane and Mary Parmenter, who were great travelers and collectors. They decorated it with feathers and shells and filled with all sorts of curiosity. It's a wonderful place to visit. The rather unusual shape is inspired by the Basilica of San Vitale at Ravenna. We also see the rise in popularity of the ornamental cottage, or cottage ornée. This is Houghton Lodge near Stockbridge in Hampshire. Essentially, it was built as a fishing lodge. But the important thing here is that the accent is on ground floor living. Up until this time, it was customary to use the first floor of the building for entertaining and for the principal purposes of a home. But here we see people wishing to be on the ground floor to facilitate some sort of communication with the outside world. And if you look at the windows, you can see that we're using, well, essentially we have floor to length or French windows. In this case with Gothic arches, very much on fashion. So people lived on the ground floor, could throw open their doors and commune with the outside world. Now, a great place to see such buildings is Sidmouth in Devon, where you'll find some that have been converted into hotels, like this one. Similar idea, we have floor length windows, French windows, Gothic arches. We can cast open those doors, we can access the outside world. Back in the day, it may have looked a little bit more like a neighboring property, which sadly is now much changed. And that was Knowle Cottage. Now, buildings like this were often traditionally thatched to enhance their picturesque quality. But what I'd like to show you regarding Knowle Cottage is an interior view of the time. Now, what we see here are those floor length windows cast open to let in the outside world. There is an attempt to create a kind of interplay, an ambiguity with the interior and the exterior. You can see these birds that have crept into the room, who are pheasants, I guess, who are pecking at the carpet as if there is real seed there. We see a scientific instrument reminding us of the era in which it is set. Notice also the use of trellis along the top here. Now, this is painted. It's all artificial, but again, it creates a kind of a merging of the outside and the inside. Trellis is becoming very popular. And one or two other views of Sidmouth, which might perhaps encourage you to visit. This is another hotel. You're seeing part of the Royal Glen Hotel here. Look at those Gothic windows, the crenellations. And buildings such as this, there are a number of them that you can see along the seafront, all rather charming. Now we should acknowledge the role of leading landscape gardeners, such as Humphrey Repton. And he was famous for his red books, which showed the improvements he could carry out to a client, on behalf of a client, and using before and after images. So at the top, in fact, what you're looking at here is Repton's own cottage. And the above image is before, a rather ordinary and not particularly exciting impression. And then beneath it, after he's carried out his improvements, we can see that it is a much more attractive and engaging environment. Repton also worked with interiors. And here we see an example above The before image is of an old cedar parlor, whilst beneath it is a modern living room. So what has happened here? We've got a very cold, uncomfortable looking room. Its wood paneling is later replaced by library shelves. So at this point, libraries become popular places for socializing and relaxing in. Libraries, galleries, and billiard rooms. All these sort of spaces become much more accessible and much more relaxed. The upper image shows a collection of chairs laid out rather formally. In the lower one, we can see that they're pushed to the walls and people are congregating rather informally. The whole doorway section has been opened up to show a kind of an enfilade through into the rest of the house. We have wall-to-wall carpet. And notice also that there are no servants. That is because of some of the technical innovations of the era. We now have the evolution of bell systems and the like, which means that servants can be summoned when required, and basically they're kept out of the way. Repton also designed unusual buildings, such as this one. This is the Bee House at Attingham in Shropshire. And for a short time in the very early 19th century, all things Greek were the order of the day. Here we see Belsay Hall in Northumberland, which was built for Sir Charles Monk in the Greek Revival fashion. So we see this very austere looking building, two Greek columns stretching down to the base, as we can see there, fluted columns. The actual lifespan of the Greek Revival style was relatively small when it came to the building of houses. I'll show you another example here. This is Dinton Park near Salisbury. Again, rather austere, but the reason for showing you this is we can go inside and look at the staircase entrance hall. Now, large entrance halls like this were often cold and uncomfortable places. They were a place to receive guests and then take them into more comfortable parts of the building. But by this time, we've got technical innovations like underfloor heating and stoves. And underfloor heating is represented here by these grids in the floor and in the staircase here. We also have the evolution of gas lamps, gas lighting. And to make everybody comfortable, the Bramah water closet was also an innovation from this period. But why was it fairly short-lived? Well, the feeling developed that living in a temple or a mausoleum was not really the most cheerful experience. And perhaps buildings like this were best suited for public or institutional use. And this is one of the reasons we see the British Museum being formed using Grecian principles. This was also a time when the growing status of the artist enabled some to express their own tastes, such as Adam Buck. Here we see the artist and his family, and we're witnessing, I guess, art and fashion combined. Behind him is a reference really to the perennial interest in 18th century classicism, the line of vases and pots and so on. And we also have this curious column here called a term. But in the foreground, we can see that they're dressed in a very contemporary fashion. In particular, Mrs. Buck is sat there dressed in a modern French Empire style dress, which in itself was inspired by classical forms, but it was popularized at this period. And she sat on a chair, which is a modern design based on a Grecian principle. But we see this sort of style very much being fashionable at this time. Mrs. Buck being presented in this fashion actually perhaps reminds us of the rather ravishing Madame de Verninac by Jacques-Louis David. We can see Madame de Verninac here sat in her Empire line dress, sitting on one of those fashionable chairs. Again, French or Napoleonic style was widely admired, as were other French Empire influences, such as tented rooms. This is a rather exceptional example. It's the tented room at the Palace of Malmaison near Paris, which was created for the Empress Josephine. The tent was a reference to Napoleon's campaign tents, which were lined with stripes, and of course are the origins of the Regency stripe we are so familiar with today. In fact, that perhaps explains why I'm seen here sitting in a tent. It's not actually a real tent, it's a faux tent. I assume that you will enjoy seeing me sitting here rather than looking at a bookcase behind me. Now, not to be behind with the fashions, George created his own tent experience in the gardens of Carlton House. Now, we don't have an image from that period, but this is the rotunda designed by John Nash. And it was one of the many temporary buildings that were erected for fetes given by the prince in the gardens. Later, it was moved to the Woolwich Arsenal, which is where you see it here, and made into a more permanent structure. Actually, it was originally built of wood, but here you can see it has been changed into a brick and lead construction. Until recently, it was a military museum. Today, the Army apparently use it as for boxing competitions. Tents also took on a more exotic look. This is a modern interpretation of the Turkish tent at Painshill Park in Surrey. Interest in the exotic, the Islamic world was very high. And another example of the variety that was pretty much de rigueur during the Regency period. And here we're going to meet another important figure in the world of Regency style. And this is Thomas Hope, actually portrayed here by the artist Beachy in Turkish dress. Apparently he used to enjoy answering his front door dressed like this. Hope was a wealthy banker and household style pioneer. His house in Duchess Street off Cavendish Square was decorated extensively in a very elaborate style. Each room was different and reflected experiences that he had come back with from his grand tours. Hope published drawings of his interiors, including one which celebrated the break of dawn. This was known as the Aurora Room. There are a number of Greek revival influences here, but of particular interest is the use of mirrors behind those curtains to reflect the light in certain ways. Also, the curtains apparently were black with gold fringes, and pulled back slightly, they gave a sort of an insight, a sort of an imitation of the herald of dawn. The sculptural figures that we can see at the far end still exist. This is Cephalus and Aurora by John Flaxman. You can see them in the Lady Lever Art Gallery on Merseyside. Aurora, goddess of the dawn, is shown seducing the youth Cephalus. But if we go back to the illustration, I'd like to draw your attention to the furniture, and in particular, this pier table here, which you can see in the Victoria and Albert Museum when it reopens. Designed by Thomas Hope, the unusual feature of those female figures, they're called caryatids, They are essentially a replacement for a column. And the inspiration comes from figures decorating the Erechtheion in Athens and are said to represent the day. Symbols of night and sleep decorate the frieze along the top. Appropriate themes, I guess, for the subject of the room. And then at the back of the table is a mirror, which is another innovation during the Regency period. You may have seen female figures like that traveling through London when you go past St Pancras Church, again directly inspired from the Erechtheion in Athens. Now, Thomas Hope helped to champion the Greek Revival style with objects like this, a table of his design. And the important issue here is the use of this decoration. This is Greek Revival decoration. It's inspired by the Anthemion, or the honeysuckle motif, but also it's a tripod table, 3 legs there, another popular Regency style. Hope was also fascinated by other ancient cultures, and one in particular that emerges as a consequence of Admiral Nelson and the Battle of the Nile, and also of Napoleon's campaigns in North Africa, is of course Egypt. Egyptomania sweeps Europe. Here we see an armchair in Egyptian style, dated around about 1804, again in the V&A. English furniture makers were very imaginative, very inventive during this period. All sorts of extraordinary items were being produced. And this is a period when other furniture items like ottomans became quite popular. Buildings in the Egyptian style also appeared. This was the Egyptian Hall on Piccadilly. Note the pylon-shaped decoration on the facade. And of course, the Egyptian fascination with the afterlife made it perfectly acceptable to use Egyptian designs in places like cemeteries. And this is the entrance to the Egyptian Avenue in Highgate Cemetery. Interest in the mystic Orient went even further afield, to India. This is Seatoncote in Gloucestershire, built for a nabob, a returning wealthy East India merchant. We see here the use of a sort of a neo-Mughal sort of architecture, and in particular, the use of that onion dome. Now, Pliny visited this building, was so impressed that he thought, well, I'll have a go at something like that. And of course, then started to carry out work on his pet project, the Marine Pavilion at Brighton. Now, architecturally, the work was commenced by Henry Holland in the late 1780s, but John Nash took over and really transformed the building. And it is, of course, famous for its Indian or Hindu exterior and its lavish Chinese-inspired interiors. Here we see the banqueting room, displaying an ongoing fashion for Chinese or chinoiserie style. You perhaps would call it lavish escapism. Now, a wonderful display of the Chinese objects from the Royal Collection is presently at the Brighton Pavilion. And we can't visit them at the present time, of course, but the exhibition is scheduled to run until September. So hopefully you'll have a chance to visit. And just to give you an idea of the experience, here are some photographs I took. This is the same room. They have attempted to recreate the decoration from the time of the print that we've just looked at. And it is absolutely extraordinary. I think perhaps the most glorious example of Regency chinoiserie that you could ever hope to experience. That there is a remanufacture. The carpet has been reinstated in one of the anterooms, and decorated around this room are these wonderful Chinese vases. And I have a fancy that this is the type of vase we saw in that earlier illustration in the Corinthian room at Carlton House. Now, collecting examples of architectural decoration becomes the passion of Regency architects and designers, such as Sir John Soane. And this is his house at Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, another wonderful place to visit and experience collections and the Regency atmosphere. We see a neoclassical combined with Greek revival style facade. The interiors are rather different, rather unexpected. For example, this is the breakfast room. It's a much more intimate house. This is not a particularly large house. This is the breakfast room, and it features these mirrors that are set into this ceiling here, the lantern to shed light. So reflections of light and so on help to create sort of picturesque atmospheres. And this ceiling, which is a form of dome called a pendentive dome, we're more familiar with it as the top of a telephone box, was actually a strong architectural reference used by Soane in many of his designs. And this goes to show, this picture shows you some of the collection in the main entrance hall. What we're experiencing here, I suppose, is art and architecture combined. But let's return to what was probably the prevailing style of the Regency, the Gothic or medieval. This is Ash Ridge in Hertfordshire, a vast Gothic revival palace that was built for the 7th Earl of Bridgewater. Today it's a business school, although you can visit on certain open days. It was designed by James Wyatt, another leading architect of the period. He was in fact president of the Royal Academy. And it doesn't really give you an idea of the scale from this angle, but if I show you an aerial view, you can see how enormous the property is. Notice also the extension here. This is the servants' wing. If you remember, I said that servants could be kept out of the way and summoned when required. Now, commentators such as Sir Uvedale Price and Richard Payne Knight extolled the virtues of the castle or Tudor style as being especially fitting for a rural landscape. Therefore, classical style properties were perhaps better suited to urban locations. But the architectural style you chose was also a kind of political statement. Tory grandees, landowners and so on favoured Tudor and Gothic styles, while Whig liberals preferred Republican classicism. An important advocate of the Gothic style was the extremely wealthy William Beckford. He developed a fascination for Gothic style at a young age. He loved Gothic novels. He wrote his own at the age of 21 called Vathek, which was inspired by tales of the Arabian Nights and the craze for Orientalism. I've tried to read it. It is a little impenetrable, but for those brave enough, it's worth exploring. Now, Beckford's love of the Gothic led him to create his own Gothic world. He had Fonthill Abbey built. This stood in Wiltshire, again designed by our friend James Wyatt. Beckford lived here pretty much alone, apart from a retinue of servants. Ash Ridge was vast, so was this building. This is the Great Western Entrance Hall, and I hope you can see those two small figures climbing the stairs there to give you an idea of the scale. This was known as the King Edward's Gallery. Remember, gallery spaces become living spaces. We have wall-to-wall carpet. It's much more comfortable than you might expect. Picture galleries, libraries, billiard rooms become social spaces. Emphasizing the Gothic is the St. Michael's Gallery with views out across the neighboring countryside. Sadly, the building was short-lived as it collapsed due to inadequate foundations, which I guess you could call a Regency trait. And Gothic style was also employed with a twist for the remodelling of Belvoir Castle in Leicestershire, which is probably the finest example of a noble Regency residence. It was rebuilt in medieval style by James Wyatt in the early 19th century for the Duke of Rutland. It was considered an appropriate setting for a nobleman to accentuate his lineage and ancestry to distinguish from new money. But the special treasure of Belvoir Castle is the Elizabeth Saloon, created in the early 1820s for Elizabeth, the 5th Duchess of Rutland. Here we see a revisiting of Louis XIV or 15th French styles. It's like a Rococo revival, even incorporating original 1730s French paneling or boiseries. An absolute joy. We might consider the use of all of these different styles as stylistic plurality. And to bring that idea home on a much smaller object, I'm showing you this little bureau bookcase. English made from around about 1810. Again, an object you could see in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Let's take a closer look at it. And I'm going to start with the doors on the top section. We can immediately see these Gothic arches. Behind them, behind the glass windows there, are watercolors showing landscape scenes, actually from the banks of the River Clyde. Notice also that wonderful striped veneer there. That's called zebra wood, a new material that was becoming available from the East Indies. Let's look elsewhere. We can see that Egypt puts in an appearance. And what about these handles with a lion's head? That possibly indicates Rome or maybe Greece. Occasionally things went too far. One commentator said, "Every room is a masquerade. The saloon Chinese, full of jars and mandarins and pagodas. The library Egyptian, all covered with hieroglyphics. They sleep in Turkish tents and dine in a Gothic chapel." In closing, I'm going to return to Thomas Hope and to his country residence, the Deep Dean. Now, this building, sadly no longer with us, stood near Dorking in Surrey. Now, originally it was a 1730s Palladian house, but Hope purchased it and then remodeled it in this kind of Italianate style, which later became the source of inspiration behind Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Now you can see a large conservatory to the side here. I think this is a Victorian addition. It didn't look like that during Hope's time. But if we consider the terrace outside, I can go back to Hope and we can look at that terrace, looking down on extensive landscape gardens, providing a kind of Virgilian retreat, a wonderful place to relax and commune with nature. And this is another view of the house, showing the Campanile tower here, the bell tower, emphasizing the Italian inspiration behind it. But what's really important is the strategic use of trees and shrubs to create a natural setting. The house was demolished in the 1960s. Sadly, the only remaining structure today is the Hope Mausoleum. Again, austere Greek revival inspiration behind it. Amazingly, it was buried, and here you see it being excavated a few years ago. And happily today, it's been restored and looks something like this. But let's take a look inside the house. This is the entrance hall. Again, classically inspired, very appropriate for a gentleman's residence. We see the use of columns, lots of stone and marble, a display of statuary appropriate for an entrance hall in this kind of environment. A place to greet people, much more intimate and comfortable are some of the other reception rooms. This is the small drawing room, showing quite a strong French Empire influence here, particularly with the decorations around the mirror, the fireplace and so on, and this bed settee. Notice also we have the circular table that we met earlier with the triangular base. If we move through the house, we come to what was known as the Theatre of the Arts, a kind of auditorium. So you would step down into this room to admire Hope's collection of busts and other antiquaries, and perhaps up the steps on the other side into the conservatory, and then out onto the conservatory terrace. Here we see a very enchanting scene. Notice the spiky plants, popularized at this time. Use of classical urns and vases, Chinese jars. Young lady here walking with her dog, carrying a parasol. And of course, no scene like this would be complete without a peacock in view. So we're going to move to my last slide now. We're going to move back towards the conservatory. At a junction between the conservatory and the library, we find this scene. Again, we have spiky plants. We have a Regency style tripod table, young lady gracing us with her presence. And nature, we see these climbing plants, flowers growing profusely. You might say that this is art and nature combined. Now, there is no single characteristic of the Regency. We look for variety, we look for eclecticism, and probably exoticism. This image perhaps represents the spirit of the Regency, not its voluptuousness, but its elegance and sophistication. And if I could spend the rest of my days sitting on those steps, I would be a very happy man. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think we're certainly had a good tour there. I think I see that we have got something coming up on the chat. So let's see. wonderfully comprehensive, beautifully illustrated from Alexandra Sheldon, and fabulously varied. I think they certainly weren't, these days we might worry about clashes of colour, but it would seem that they were rather too inspired to worry about such things. And Alexandra comments, you might be interested to know